Story number 1. Yesterday, the governor of Nairobi banned public transport from entering the city center. This meant that people had to walk long distances to work. And since there are not enough sidewalks, many people ended up walking on the roads. This caused a traffic jam that lasted for more than 5 hours. The next day, the ban was lifted. The governor's goal was to reduce traffic congestion and noise pollution, but his actions actually made the problem worse. The governor's decision was based on the assumption that public transport is the main cause of traffic congestion. However, this is not the case. Traffic congestion is caused by a variety of factors, including the number of cars on the road, the design of the roads, and the way that traffic is managed. Banning public transport only shifted the problem to another group of people. It also made it more difficult for people to get to work and school, which can have a negative impact on the economy. This is an example of how well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences. It is important to carefully consider the potential consequences of any policy before implementing it. Story number 2. Washington State made it mandatory for schools to drop their room temperatures to save on electricity. This was done in an effort to reduce the state's energy consumption. However, the results were not as expected. Teachers and staff were cold in the classrooms, so they brought their own heaters. This led to an increase in electricity consumption. In some cases, the heaters were so powerful that they caused the thermostats to malfunction. Story number 3. I go to a school that has been dropping the temperature in the classrooms in an effort to save money. They say that it costs $1,000 a day to heat the buildings. However, this has caused problems for students and teachers. In the morning, the temperature in my classroom can be as low as 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is too cold for some students, especially those who are wearing light clothing. Some students have brought in space heaters to warm up, but these are illegal by the fire code. The administration and maintenance staff are aware of the problem, but they refuse to turn up the heat. They say that they are following orders from the school board. However, this is causing a lot of discomfort for students and teachers. I think that the school is taking the wrong approach to this problem. They should be finding ways to heat the buildings more efficiently, rather than making students and teachers suffer in the cold. Story number 4. During my time in college, there was a policy where hospitals had to involve the police when treating underage individuals for alcohol poisoning. This caused a dilemma. Students feared legal consequences and avoided calling for help. Although there weren't many fatal cases, the policy inadvertently discouraged students from seeking immediate medical assistance for their peers due to the potential legal fallout. This shows how well-intentioned policies can lead to unintended consequences that hinder the safety and support needed in such situations. Story number 5. I worked at a company that had a strict clean desk policy on Fridays. This meant that we had to clear our desks of all paperwork and personal belongings before we left for the weekend. The common way around this was to sweep all our paperwork into an envelope and send it through the internal mail. The mailroom would then deliver our envelopes back to our desks on Monday morning. This system worked pretty well, but it wasn't perfect. Sometimes our envelopes would get lost in the mail, or they would arrive late, and sometimes we would forget to put something important in the envelope, and we would have to scramble to find it on Monday morning. Overall, the clean desk policy was a good idea. It helped to keep our desks clean and organized, and it also helped to protect our company's confidential information. But it wasn't perfect, and there were always ways to get around it. Story number 6. In 1936, the president of Paraguay, José Félix Estigarribia, passed a law that made it illegal for people of the same race to marry. The law was intended to promote racial mixing and to eliminate racism in Paraguay. The law was met with resistance from many Paraguayans who saw it as an infringement on their freedom of choice. The law was also criticized by human rights groups, who argued that it was discriminatory and violated the right to marry. The law was eventually repealed in 1989, after the fall of the Stroessner dictatorship. However, its legacy continues to be felt in Paraguay, where racism is still a problem. The story of the law in Paraguay is a reminder that racism is a complex issue that cannot be solved by simplistic measures. In fact, attempts to force people to mix with other races can often backfire and lead to more resentment and division. The best way to eliminate racism is through education and understanding. We need to teach people about the history of racism and its harmful effects. We also need to create a society where everyone is treated with respect, regardless of their race or ethnicity. The story of the law in Paraguay is a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to legislate against racism. It is important to remember that racism is a problem that cannot be solved by laws or decrees. It is a problem that can only be solved by changing hearts and minds. Story number 7. When I was in kindergarten, there was a rule that you had to eat whatever you touched. This rule was put in place to prevent kids from wasting food, but it had some unintended consequences. One day, I was in the lunchroom, and I saw a kid touching all the food on his tray. He was clearly trying to call dibs on it so that no one else could eat it. I was disgusted, but I didn't say anything, because I didn't want to get in trouble. After that, I started to notice that other kids were doing the same thing. They would touch all the food on their trays, even if they didn't want to eat it. They just wanted to make sure that no one else could have it. The rule was eventually changed, but it left a lasting impression on me. It taught me that even well-intentioned rules can have unintended consequences. Story number 8. A head teacher made a rule that kids couldn't run in the playground. The rule was difficult to enforce and had unintended consequences, such as kids getting bored and restless. The rule was eventually changed so that kids could run, but they had to be careful. The new rule was more effective and kept the kids safe. Story number 9. The middle school principal was determined to create a trash-free environment. He thought that if he removed all the trash cans, the students would be forced to take their trash home with them or throw it away in the classrooms. The principal's plan backfired. Overnight, the amount of litter skyrocketed. The hallways were littered with food wrappers, paper cups, and plastic bottles. The parking lot was covered in trash. The students were not happy with the new policy. They complained that they had to carry their trash all day long, and they didn't want to throw it away in the classrooms because it would make the classrooms dirty. After a week, the principal realized that his plan had not worked. He brought back the trash cans, and the amount of litter decreased. The principal learned a valuable lesson. He learned that even well-intentioned plans can have unintended consequences. He also learned that it is important to listen to the people who will be affected by a plan before implementing it. Story number 10. It was a hot summer day in Sweden, and the bus drivers were sweating in their uniforms. They had been asking their management to allow them to wear shorts, but their requests had been denied. The drivers were fed up. They decided to protest the dress code by wearing skirts instead. They figured that if the dress code allowed women to wear skirts, it should allow men to wear them too. The drivers' protest quickly caught on. Bus drivers all over Sweden started wearing skirts to work. The media picked up on the story, and soon the whole country was talking about it. The bus company's management eventually relented. They allowed the drivers to wear shorts, and the protest came to an end. The bus drivers' protest was a success. They showed that even a seemingly small issue can be a big deal if people are willing to stand up for what they believe in. They also showed that gender norms can be challenged, even in a country as progressive as Sweden. Story number 11. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Athens was facing a serious air pollution problem. The city was home to a large number of old, heavily polluted cars, and the air quality was becoming increasingly unhealthy. The Greek government decided to take action to reduce air pollution. They introduced a policy that allowed cars with odd-numbered license plates to drive on odd-numbered days of the month, and cars with even-numbered license plates to drive on even-numbered days of the month. The government thought that this policy would have the number of cars on the road, which would lead to a significant reduction in air pollution. However, the policy had the opposite effect. Instead of having the number of cars on the road, the policy doubled it. People who owned 2 cars, one with an odd-numbered license plate and one with an even-numbered license plate, were now able to drive both cars every day. This led to more traffic congestion and more air pollution. The government was forced to abandon the policy after a few years. The odd-even-number car plate policy in Athens is a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of government policies. Sometimes, policies that are intended to solve one problem can actually make the problem worse. In this case, the government's attempt to reduce air pollution by limiting the number of cars on the road actually led to more traffic congestion and more air pollution. This is because people responded to the policy by buying 2 cars, one with an odd-numbered license plate and one with an even-numbered license plate. The odd-even-number car plate policy is also a reminder that it is important to think about the unintended consequences of any policy before it is implemented. In this case, the government did not consider the possibility that people would respond to the policy by buying 2 cars. If they had, they might have chosen a different policy that would have been more effective in reducing air pollution. Story number 12. I used to work at a hotel that decided to have an alcohol-free holiday party. This didn't sit well with the people who had been working there for years and were accustomed to a full bar at the party. The staff parking lot ended up being full of people drinking in their cars, trying to get a good buzz to carry them through the party. Most people ended up getting way drunker than they would have done if there had been alcohol at the party, and the party was a crap show. There were people puking in the bathroom, people fighting, and people passing out. It was a complete disaster. The next day, the hotel management realized that they had made a mistake. They apologized to the staff and promised that there would be alcohol at the next holiday party. The moral of the story is that sometimes it's better to stick with tradition. If people are expecting alcohol at a party, then it's better to have it there. Trying to force people to have an alcohol-free party is just going to lead to problems. Story number 13. My friend, let's call her Sarah, was getting married. She and her husband-to-be, let's call him John, were both sober, and they wanted their wedding to be a sober event. They told their guests that there would be no alcohol at the wedding, and they offered them non-alcoholic drinks instead. However, many of the guests brought their own alcohol, or they snuck it in. One of the guests, let's call them David, brought a bag of fairy dust. Fairy dust is a powder that is said to have psychoactive effects. David told the other guests that the fairy dust would make them feel happy and euphoric. Many of the guests took the fairy dust, and they quickly started to feel its effects. They were laughing and dancing, and they were having a great time. The parents of the bride and groom were not happy. They had wanted a sober wedding, and they were disappointed that their guests were getting drunk on fairy dust. However, Sarah and John were happy. They were glad that their guests were having a good time, and they didn't mind that they were using fairy dust instead of alcohol. In the end, the wedding was a success. The guests had a great time, and the bride and groom were happy. Story number 13. I worked at a school that had a dress code policy that required all shirts to have the school name or emblem. The emblem was a fancy letter E. The policy did not specify how the name or emblem had to be displayed, the color, or if it had to be permanently affixed to the clothing. The students hated the policy, and they were always looking for ways to get around it. They found a loophole in the policy that allowed them to wear whatever they wanted. The loophole was that the policy did not say that the name or emblem had to be made of fabric. The students started making paper eases of the school emblem and pinning them to their shirts. This way, they could wear whatever they wanted, and they were still technically in dress code compliance. The administration was not happy about this loophole. They tried to close it by adding a new rule that said that the name or emblem had to be made of fabric. However, the students found another loophole. They started making fabric eases of the school emblem. The administration eventually gave up trying to close the loophole. They realized that the students were more creative than they were, and they couldn't think of a way to close the loophole without making the dress code too restrictive. The students were happy with their victory. They had found a way to wear whatever they wanted and still be in dress code compliance. The administration was not happy, but they knew that they had been beaten. Story number 14. When it comes to the history of LiveJournal's downfall, you'll find it labeled as outdated and overtaken by newer platforms like HIPAA. These changes had 2 notable impacts. First, the introduction of unimpressive features that made the platform less user-friendly, and second, a surprising ban on explicit adult content. This decision puzzled many, as unconventional adult content had been a significant part of Tumblr's identity. With adult content gone, some critics joked that Tumblr's landscape would be reduced to just one lonely blog titled "Bring Back the Adult Content." Story number 15. St. Michael's Catholic School was a prestigious institution with a reputation for academic excellence. The library was well stocked with books on a variety of subjects, including the Harry Potter series. However, one day, a parent complained to the school administration that the Harry Potter books were satanic and promoting witchcraft. The administration, bowing to pressure from the parent, banned the books from the school library. The students were outraged by the ban. They felt that the Harry Potter books were harmless, and that the ban was an infringement on their freedom of expression. Soon, a black market for Harry Potter books emerged. Students would trade or sell their books to other students, often at inflated prices. The ban only made the books more popular, and students were more determined than ever to get their hands on them. The situation came to a head when a student was caught with a Harry Potter book in his possession. He was threatened with expulsion, but he refused to give up the book. The school administration eventually relented and lifted the ban on the Harry Potter books. The students were overjoyed, and the books remained popular at St. Michael's Catholic School for many years to come. Yes, this situation is similar to what happens in the Harry Potter book, Order of the Phoenix. When Dolores Umbridge, the new defense against the dark arts teacher, bans the Quibbler, a magazine that Harry and his friends write for. The Quibbler is the only source of information about Voldemort's return, so when it is banned, everyone wants to read it even more. This shows how censorship can backfire and actually make something more popular. In both cases, the bans on Harry Potter and the Quibbler were motivated by fear and ignorance. The parents who complained about Harry Potter were afraid that the books would corrupt their children, and Umbridge was afraid that the Quibbler would spread dangerous ideas. However, these bans only served to make the books more popular and to fuel the curiosity of the students. In the end, the truth prevailed, and the books were allowed to be read freely. Story number 16. I worked as a social worker for a contract agency that worked with Child Protective Services, CPS. CPS policy is to never tell the parents who called CPS on them, but my agency's policy was to always inform the primary caretaker if one of our social workers called it in. This was a stupid rule, in my opinion, because it irreversibly destroyed our rapport with our clients. Imagine telling a parent that you called CPS on them, only to knock on their door the next week to listen to their concerns. The parent would be understandably angry and distrustful, and it would be very difficult to build a relationship with them. This rule also made it very difficult to do our job effectively. We couldn't get the information we needed from the parents because they didn't trust us. I eventually left that agency because I couldn't work under such a ridiculous rule. I believe that CPS should always protect the confidentiality of their sources, and that social workers should never be put in the position of having to betray the trust of their clients. I understand that there are some cases where it may be necessary to inform the parents who called CPS, such as if there is a danger of retaliation. However, these cases should be the exception, not the rule. In general, it is best to keep the identity of the caller confidential. I hope that my agency will eventually change their policy. In the meantime, I would encourage other social workers to speak out against this practice. We need to protect the confidentiality of our sources and build trust with our clients, so that we can effectively do our job of protecting children. Story number 17. I worked at a salon as a hairstylist. One day, the manager decided to drug test all of the stylists. Out of the 12 stylists, 11 failed the test. The manager was surprised and didn't know what to do. He didn't want to fire all of the stylists, but he also didn't want to keep them if they were using drugs. The next day, the manager texted everyone and told them to come to work. He didn't say anything about the drug test results. He just wanted to see how things would go. The stylists were all nervous about the drug test results, but they were relieved that they still had their jobs. They all agreed to be more careful in the future. I'm a stylist myself, and I tell this story to applicants all the time. I tell them that if they drug tested all of the stylists in the world, there wouldn't be anyone working. Hairdressing is a stressful job, and many stylists use drugs to cope with the stress. I think it's important for employers to be understanding of this. They should focus on providing a supportive work environment and helping stylists to manage their stress in healthy ways. Drug testing is not the answer. In the case of the salon I worked at, the manager eventually decided to implement a drug testing policy. However, he also implemented other policies to support the stylists, such as providing free counseling services. This helped to create a more positive work environment and reduce the need for stylists to use drugs. Story number 18. I went to a Christian school in elementary and middle school. Magic the Gathering and the Pokemon card game were pretty popular among the boys. They would get together after lunch to play before classes started again. One day, a teacher or administrator found out about the card games. They saw the art on some of the Magic the Gathering cards, which depicted demons and other occult imagery. They decided that these games were the work of Satan and that they were corrupting the minds of the students. Almost overnight, all trading card games were banned from school. Any cards that were found would be confiscated until the end of the school year. This didn't sit well with the boys, who now had a lot of free time on their hands. They started to get into trouble, running around, pushing each other, and going places they weren't supposed to. The school administration was surprised by this. They had thought that banning the card games would keep the boys occupied and out of trouble. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The boys were bored and restless, and they were looking for ways to entertain themselves. The next year, a new administrator came to the school. He decided to lift the ban on trading card games. The boys were overjoyed, and they started playing again. This time, the school administration didn't have any problems with it. They realized that the card games were actually a good thing. They kept the boys occupied, quiet, and civil. They also helped to reinforce math skills and teach problem solving. I think this story is a good example of how banning something can sometimes have the opposite effect of what you intended. In this case, banning the trading card games made the boys more bored and restless, which led to them getting into trouble. When the ban was lifted, the boys were able to play the games again, and they were actually better behaved. I think it's important for schools to be flexible and to think about the unintended consequences of their policies. Banning something just because it's popular or because you don't understand it is not always the best solution. Sometimes it's better to let kids be kids and to let them find ways to entertain themselves that are harmless and productive. Story number 19. I used to work for immigration. One day, a new policy was implemented that said that we would no longer remove people who had been caught smuggling illicit substances from certain countries. The reason for this policy was that the government believed it was too risky to deport people who had failed to complete their jobs back to angry gangs. The news of this policy spread quickly, and within a few weeks, there was a huge spike in smuggling. People were smuggling over illicit substances and immediately handing themselves over to the authorities to guarantee that they wouldn't get deported. In addition, drug dealers found it much easier to convince people to attempt to smuggle illicit substances because it was a win-win for all parties. The smugglers got paid, and the drug dealers got their drugs into the country. The government quickly realized that this policy was a mistake. It was making it easier for drug smugglers to operate, and it was also putting people at risk. The policy was scrapped, and the old policy of removing people who were caught smuggling illicit substances was reinstated. This story is a good example of how unintended consequences can arise from well-intentioned policies. In this case, the government thought that they were protecting people by not deporting them back to dangerous countries. However, the unintended consequence was that they made it easier for drug smugglers to operate. It's important to think about the unintended consequences of any policy before it is implemented. Sometimes, the best solution is not the most obvious one. Story number 20. I work in a grocery store. Last week, my boss decided to take away our electric cart pusher machine because he felt we didn't need it. He said that we could just push the carts by hand. The very next day, the store was absolutely packed. We had a lot of customers, and they all had a lot of carts. We were trying to push the carts by hand, but it was taking forever. We couldn't get the carts in fast enough. The customers were getting impatient. They were complaining that they had to wait too long for their carts. We were getting stressed out. We were trying our best, but we couldn't keep up. Finally, my boss realized that he had made a mistake. He called the store manager and told him to bring back the electric cart pusher machine. The machine was brought back, and we were able to get the carts in much faster. The customers were happy, and we were relieved. We learned our lesson. We won't take our electric cart pusher machine for granted again. This story is a good example of how unintended consequences can arise from well-intentioned decisions. In this case, my boss thought that we didn't need the electric cart pusher machine because we could just push the carts by hand. However, he didn't realize that the store would be packed the next day. As a result, we couldn't get the carts in fast enough, and the customers were unhappy. It's important to think about the unintended consequences of any decision before it is made. Sometimes, the best solution is not the most obvious one. Story number 21. In the 1950s, Australia was experiencing a surfing boom. People of all ages and backgrounds were taking to the waves, and it was becoming a popular pastime. However, the government was concerned that people were surfing during work hours, and they wanted to discourage this. So, the government came up with a creative solution. They passed a law that said that any man who surfed before 5 p.m. would have to do so in a dress. The idea was that this would be so embarrassing that people would stop surfing during work hours. However, the law had the opposite effect. Instead of discouraging people from surfing, it actually encouraged them to do it more. Men started dressing up in their wives' dresses and heading to the beach to surf. This became a popular trend, and for a few weeks, the beaches were filled with men in dresses surfing. Eventually, the government realized that the law was not working, and they repealed it. However, the story of the men in dresses surfing in Australia is still a popular one, and it is often used as an example of how well-intentioned laws can sometimes have unintended consequences. This story is a good example of how people can sometimes find creative ways to circumvent rules and regulations. In this case, the men who wanted to surf during work hours found a way to do it without breaking the law. They simply dressed up in their wives' dresses and went surfing. It's important to remember that rules and regulations are not always effective. Sometimes they can actually make the problem worse. In this case, the law that was supposed to discourage surfing during work hours actually encouraged it. It's also important to be aware of the unintended consequences of any rule or regulation. Sometimes, the unintended consequences can be worse than the problem that the rule was supposed to solve.